In this series of videos I'm attempting to repair and restore a pair of HP9120A printers. In the previous video I stripped this print mechanism down completely, so this is just one of the mechanisms out of one of the printers, and we found that the paper roller, as usual, had completely disintegrated. So what I've done since is remove the remaining material, that's what this black gunk here is, from the roller. And we're left with this, and what we're going to do in this video is make up a new rubber roller for it. I've also been over the rest of the mechanism and checked all the various parts. The basic frame is in good condition. You may have noticed in the previous video that one of the inserts unscrewed itself, so we've got an insert here to refit, and that just goes into this hole here. It should be in that hole, but it's unscrewed itself, so we'll screw that back in. I've looked at all these shafts, I've polished them up, and they've all come up very nicely. None are bent, no excessive wear, and they're looking good. The head carrier, again, I've cleaned this, in very good condition. Bit of wear in the bushing, but it's not too bad, certainly usable. I polished up the paper guide lens and cut off, and I use Novus number 2 for this. But use whatever plastic polish takes your fancy, and again that's come up very nice and clean. It was completely yellowed before, but it's come up almost totally clear. All the other shafts are looking good, bushings are looking good. I've cleaned up and de-rusted the sprag clutch. This is kind of a one-way clutch system to make sure the paper can't be driven backwards, and it works a bit like a Chinese finger puzzle. It's kind of a spring, but if you try and turn the shaft that sits in here one way, it has a tendency to expand the spring, lets it turn. If you try and turn it the other way, slight bit of drag causes the spring to kind of compress, and that increases the drag, which causes the spring to compress even more. It just locks up solid and only allows you to turn the shaft one way. The rest of it's looking fairly good. The guide roller is looking quite good, needs cleaning yet, but is sliding, and I have checked the solenoid and that's fine. So as I say in this video, what I'm going to do is rebuild the drive roller. Many different ways you could go about doing this, and once I've taken off the old what I assume was at one point rubber, I'm left with this. You notice the center section is kind of roughed up. That's done like that on purpose at the factory when they make it, and that's so that the adhesive will stick to it. Obviously the adhesive is not going to stick very well to the chromed surface. It's cleaned up fairly well, but what I'm going to do is tape off the ends and bead blast the center section just to get it back to a nice even fairly well textured finish, and then I'm going to cut a piece of rubber tubing. You can use something like silicone tubing. I tend to find in this sort of application that silicone tubing is a bit too soft and compliant, and it has a tendency to kind of walk one way or the other down the shaft. Even if you glue it on, it tends to kind of move around a lot, whereas rubber tends to stay where you put it. This is a 14.2mm diameter shaft, so we want 14 internal diameter tubing, and then measuring on the outside and between the fingers, it's 3/4 of an inch or thereabouts. So we want something around the sort of 18.5, 19mm mark. I'm going to do that in the workshop. I won't do it here, and as I say, first thing is get this taped off and bead blasted, and then we'll have a quick look before we put the rubber onto it. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to fit the rubber while fitting this. I suspect in the factory what they do is just clip this over once the rubber's been fitted, but there's no way I'm going to risk trying to clip this over. It almost certainly would just snap off. It's very old and brittle, so that's not really an option for me to do that, and so I'll have to assemble the roller and the guide as one and slide them both on together. Okay, I'll get this taped up, have a quick look at that, and then we'll get it over to the workshop and I'll get it bead blasted. Incidentally, the bushings are fine as well. I've measured those and they're quite a nice fit on the shaft. Okay, I've got the first layer of tape on. So this is quite hard tape, but gives a very nice clean edge. Unfortunately, the bead blaster will take this off because it's too hard. So what I do now is, I've got a nicely defined edge, but I now use wiring loom tape. This is quite sort of springy, and it prevents the bead blast shot from knocking it off. The bead blasting media just bounces off it. So I'll get this put on top of this tape, and this will give us a nicely defined edge, but this will make sure that we don't blow it off with the bead blaster. So after bead blasting, we have a very nicely prepared even surface, and that will take the glue extremely well. So let's get the tape off so we can see the part and make sure we haven't damaged the ends. So as you can see, that's come up extremely nicely. Got a nice textured center section, haven't messed up the outer portion, and the next thing we have to do is cut a length of rubber tubing that's approximately the length, so it will sit between these two cheeks. It must be slightly shorter to allow a bit of clearance and a bit of creep in the rubber, but you'll see that once we've fitted that, we'll have quite a nice fresh roller, and it will be pretty much as good as new. What I'm going to have to do, because I need to slide the tubing on with this plastic part, I'm going to slide it on without any glue, and I'll use a syringe to inject some glue through the gap at this section where we've got some clearance, and that way it will stop the rubber tubing from moving around over time. Okay, so I've cut a piece of rubber tubing to the correct length, and I know somebody will ask, so the way I go about cutting this, because obviously you can see it's curved, it comes on a reel, but you need to make sure that when it's pushed onto a tube, it's going to be square to the tube and the right length. So what I do is I slide it onto a piece of bar that's the same diameter as the target roller it's going to go on, and then I use a very sharp button cutter in the lathe, running at high speed. A high speed rubber acts like a much harder material, and you can turn a very nice even finish on it. It gives you a very square finish, and you can of course then also turn it to the correct length. So what I'm going to do now is assemble all this. So this will sit in the gap between here, and then this will of course slide through it. So I'll get that pushed into place and we'll have a quick look at it. Okay, so that's now refitted, and I left about 1/2 mil of clearance. It looks like more than that at the moment. I've just pushed this on, and over the next hour or so this will relax slightly. Obviously pushing it on from one end tends to compress it a little bit, and that's another reason for using a piece of bar to cut it to length. It makes sure it ends up at the correct relaxed length. So this, as I say, over the next hour or so will expand a little bit, but I want a small amount of clearance. I don't want it kind of binding this up, but you can see that the gap between the roller and this guide is about the width of a piece of paper. In fact, I'll just get a piece of paper and we'll see if we can pass it through there. Okay, just take a piece of paper and we should be able to slide that through this gap quite nicely, and it should be quite a nice fit, which it is. This is not what actually drives the paper or pinches it. That's what the fingers are for, or secondary purpose of those fingers we looked at in the previous video. We need to make sure this turns without binding and allows a piece of paper to pass through without there being too much clearance, and as you can see it's extremely nice. Like I said, I tend to use rubber rather than silicone. Silicone tends to be a bit soft and it will tend to kind of move around on the roller, on the steel roller. So you put it in the right place, you'll come back and after a few prints you might find it's moved along a little bit one way or the other, or it might have kind of offset itself and no longer be centered. Whereas fairly hard rubber like this tends to be fairly stable. You don't want to use the rubber that has the strengthening nylon in it or cord. You want just pure rubber tubing, and this is 14mm inside diameter by 18 outside, and it's exactly the right size, and it's got quite a nice texture. The other thing I tend to do, which I've already done with this, is if you rub it fairly hard on its surface. It's got kind of a release agent on there anyway for when it's made, but also it will tend to give it more of a kind of a dull matte finish rather than being shiny, and sort of grip the paper better. Okay, so the next thing is we can get the rest of this assembled. So in the next video we'll start to put the entire print mechanism back together, and hopefully we can get it to come back to life.